This is going to be completely unprecedented. It is going to affect medicine in ways we've never seen before.
You can match a blood transfusion to a blood type. What if matching a cancer cure to our genetic code was just as easy, just as standard? And that's the promise of precision medicine, delivering the right treatments at the right time, every time, to the right person.
Precision medicine enables the ultimate delivery of personalized medicine, which means that you come to your doctor, you have your genetic information, and the doctor can use that genetic information to specifically design treatments for you. But obviously, there will be thousands of individuals that have your disease and your gene. And so it's personal for you, but it's also treating large numbers of people in the same situation. We can look at individual tumors. We can even look at individual cells within tumors and understand how their system has gone awry. It's possible to analyze this very complex data using state-of-the-art computer algorithms to be able to see the interaction of proteins in a cancer cell and to design drugs that will inhibit or treat them. A really good example of how all this works is with a drug called Gleevec. And this is a drug for a certain type of leukemia. This drug had a miraculous effect. I mean, it basically cured the disease. However, the individuals who received this 6 months, a year later, it was back. Then a second drug was developed. We had the tools to go back, look at the sequence of that reverted protein and know where the change was, and then design a second drug to address that. And now the combination of those two drugs that are used in sequence basically has cured one form of this disease. And so I think that's what's going to happen. There'll be more and more examples of cases where we can join genetics, biology, and medicine. In heart disease, the chairman of physiology, Andy Marks, has been studying a receptor that is absolutely central to how the heart functions. And recently, they determined a three-dimensional structure of this protein. That has then led very quickly to the development of small molecule drugs that address certain heart diseases. That defines precision medicine because it can't be more precise than having a high-resolution three-dimensional structure that tells you something about the human disease.
What's so exciting is that we have the possibility of leading an entirely new era of medicine that makes sure new jobs and new industries and new life-saving treatments for diseases are created right here in the United States.
5 years ago, it was about $10,000 to sequence a whole genome. 10 years before that, almost $1 billion was spent worldwide in sequencing this. Today, we can sequence a whole genome in 24 hours for $1,500. But when you take 1,500 times the number of people you need to see before you begin to learn the relationship between the genetics and medicine, that's a very big number.
It is difficult to forecast exactly what the financial implications of precision medicine are going to be. On the one hand, if drugs are tailored to very specific populations, the prices are higher because the value to the patient is also higher. On the other hand, today many people are taking drugs that are really not doing them any good. We can avoid the unnecessary costs of inappropriate medication. That would be cost saving.
It's important for the lay public to understand that this doesn't happen overnight. The genetics is now straightforward. We can sequence very rapidly, very cheaply, but we still have to add on to that the drugs developing, and that takes time.
So for a lot of diseases, genetic diseases, of course, there's nothing we can really do. There are definitely families we've discovered, that everyone knows carry disease-causing alleles that basically, if they have a child with that disease, the child's going to die. And nothing can really be done other than ease the suffering. Now, in those families, People often say, well, what can you really do except, know in advance? Well, if you've ever been in one of those studies with those people and seen the relief on, let's say, a young woman's face who's pregnant, finding out that in fact she doesn't carry that mutation, so she doesn't ever have to worry about that. That's huge. So it's not just about this sort of grim and grisly fact of finding out, who's going to get brain cancer, who's going to get breast cancer, right? It's also about pretty solid knowledge that you're not. And, what's that worth as you go through your day-to-day life? I think a lot.
If we use a genetic test called Oncotype, DX, Oncotype is used to decide whether a woman with breast cancer, after she's undergone initial surgery, should go through chemotherapy to prevent the relapse of that breast cancer. If you have a population of 100 women with breast cancer, the reality is to define the appropriate patients to be exposed to chemotherapy, we have to test everyone. So that means we need to add the additional cost of the test for the whole population and making sure that the correct population then receive chemotherapy. So there's a balance in costs. We pay more for the genetic test up front, but we'll most likely pay less for the chemotherapy in that population on the back end because less women will be tested and shown that they should in fact receive that chemotherapy.
The low-hanging fruit in precision medicine and having access to all of this data is in pharmacogenomics. And by that, I mean making sure that we don't give you the wrong medicine. So all of us carry genetic variants that make us predisposed to have adverse reactions to several medications. When they look at even a handful of medications, they find that many of us carry mutations that could make it harmful for us to take a particular medication. And once everybody has their genome as part of their medical record, anytime you're given a prescription, they're immediately going to check to see whether or not you're carrying a mutation that says, no, don't provide this medication because you're going to give this person an adverse reaction. That, I think, is the way that precision medicine will impact most of us immediately. And that's going to cut down on a lot of costs because sometimes, when you give, the right patient the wrong medication, if it doesn't cost their life, it can cost millions of dollars in medical bills and seriously degraded quality of life on top of that. So making sure that people take appropriate medications is going to be one of the first benefits of precision medicine.
Ultimately, what we envision is that genomes will be sequenced for many, most, maybe all patients, so that genetic information that is telling us more and more about our predisposition to disease will be available for everyone. We see this as a very democratic process where everyone should be able to have access to that information and to benefit from it. And the great thing about DNA sequence is that it doesn't change through your life. So if you have it done early in life, it'll be the same decades later. What does change is what we know about that sequence, what we know about how variants in that sequence can contribute to disease, because we're learning more all the time. So patients in the future could be notified that, well, we now know that you are at substantially increased risk of disease X, and there are treatments, there are strategies that can help prevent it from ever happening. And that's where we see this information as potentially being very, very valuable, playing a key role in preventive medicine.
The difference in the new personalised medicine trials is that for the first time we won't actually be having the result of the trial applying to a large population. It'll only apply to a relatively small subgroup. So those entered into the trial have less of a chance of benefiting unless we target the treatment appropriately. But the real issue is, as we divide a population up into increasingly small subsets, we run the risk of having underpowered trials if we try and do things the way we've done them with big randomised studies to sort out the efficacy and toxicity of new treatments. So what we're going to have to do is a whole new paradigm, probably N of 1 studies, proof of principle studies if you will, a small study to look at efficacy and toxicity, and then the interrogation of large digital databases to fine-tune results that we would have otherwise done in separate randomised trials. And if we don't do that, we run the risk of doing trials that will never get the answers that we want from them. Genetic counselling is interesting because we're not only dealing with the person involved in the counselling, the information and the implications of that information apply to their relatives as well. And so it's far broader, and so issues that are conventional about privacy of the individual simply may not be able to be applied here. The other issue with genetic counselling is that we're giving patients information about probabilities of future events, and that will introduce uncertainty, and possibly a distressing uncertainty, but they need the information to be able to make informed decisions about their future. But it's quite different from other medicine, which is working towards a certain outcome. We're actually introducing what could be quite a distressing uncertainty. Big data is all about hyperconnectability of data, bringing in data sets from many different places and joining them together. And it's actually about data linkage. And for linking data, you need it to be identified while you link it and then de-identified when it's analysed and you report the results. And the problem is always whether there can be either re-identification or whether there can be a problem in the linkage set of keeping the data identified. So is the patient's privacy going to be respected? But then we have the problem as the data set fans out, it's not clear always whether it will be used by others for the purpose for which the person who donated their data intended. And it's very difficult to know whether they can give broad enough consent to be able to keep on interrogating the big database as time goes on. Tissue banks are problematic ethically because they involve taking some tissue and linking that with clinical data sets. So you need identification of the data to allow the linkage, and then when you're reporting on the vast biobank, it should be de-identified so a patient's information can't be linked to them. And people worry about the privacy of that process. So that issue has to be resolved. But the bigger issue is probably that over time we're going to need to use that tissue perhaps for investigations that weren't initially envisaged as technology and information change. And can a patient give sufficiently broad consent to allow that to happen? What happens if the original donor is a child? Do they have to re-consent? What happens if you can't re-contact a patient? Are you allowed to still use that tissue sample and its information? And the custodian of a databank, if in fact you can identify the custodian, and that may also have implications for commercialisation, if they discover something that would be important to the well-being of a single individual who donated to that data bank, do they have a responsibility to report back? And I think all of these things need to be sorted out in a governance process prior to setting up the data bank. genomic policy really has to be about privacy. Genomic data is so powerful that re-identifying an individual could be quite problematic for them. So the protection of their individual data in a large database is important. But I guess the other issue that would worry people is the possibility that their genomic data could be used to discriminate against them. For example, in being able to be insured, medical insurance, travel insurance, or even their employment prospects, in particular high-risk employment chances that they may have. And we don't want to see that sort of discrimination, certainly if we've got some of the population having genomic tests and others without, and there'd be a difference between those two. So we need to actually protect people against their data being misused in that way.